Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to this, the 6th instalment of the Jeremy Bamber White House Farm arc. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, please do so before proceeding with this one. In the last episode, I detailed the suspicions of Jeremy's relatives and Detective Sergeant Stan Jones, with a major breakthrough in the case being made a month after the killings, when Jeremy's girlfriend Julie implicated him in the murders, and ultimately led to him being charged with 5 counts of murder. Join me this time as we delve into the trial of Jeremy Bamber. With Jeremy being arrested at the end of September 1985, it would prove to be a long and agonising wait for those connected to the case, as the months dragged slowly towards the trial, which commenced on Thursday the 2nd of October 1986. The prosecution, led by Anthony Arledge QC, opened the proceedings by outlining the accusations and evidence against Jeremy, alongside details which would call into question his character. Addressing the jury of 7 men and 5 women at Chelmsford Crown Court, Anthony Arledge would advise that although the prosecution did not have to prove a motive, there were key details which may help the jury to understand what led to the murders at White House Farm. He went on to explain that 24-year-old Jeremy Bamber was a man who lived a lavish lifestyle. He indulged in alcohol, drugs, holidays, and items which presented a facade of an individual with wealth. However, it was believed that he was in fact living beyond his means. Jeremy would be presented as a man driven by greed, and perhaps it was a need for money, either to pay off growing debts or just because he wanted access to his inheritance sooner, that led him to plan his family's deaths. The prosecution went on to detail the substantial portfolio which the defendant would be entitled to inherit, which had been valued at approximately £436,000, over $1.3 million today. This sum included business interests, property, money, and items of value. Basil Clarke, the executor of Neville and June's estates, confirmed that Jeremy had also been given a small parcel of land in 1984, on which the 24-year-old could continue farming should the tenancy at White House Farm come to an end. Basil added that the ownership of this land was in dispute, with him clarifying that Neville had been given it by his mother in 1981, but Neville's nephew, Anthony Pargeter, had alleged it was his property. This would be one of many references to possible tensions in the family, with the suggestion being that the relatives were unhappy that Jeremy was going to inherit property they themselves had a vested interest in. This was either because it was a property they lived in, land they farmed, or in the case of Ossia Road Caravan Park, Jeremy was due to inherit a 50% stake, giving him a controlling share in the business. And although it could not be proven that he had seen the official wills of Neville and June, it was suggested he may have found a rough draft, lightly kept in the office at White House Farm. Or he may have read a letter, written by June, which had been found in a drawer in the main bedroom at the house. Despite instructions on the envelope stating that it should only be read upon her death, Basil Clarke claimed that the envelope had already been opened. Within the contents of the letter, June had provided a list of items and the individual she wished to receive them upon her death. She also wrote, "Darling husband, Sheila and Jem, my darlings, should anything happen to me, and I have to leave you, I write this to tell you of my love for you and to thank you for all you have given me." Basil Clarke confirmed that nowhere in this document, nor in her will, did June specify that she wished to make changes in favour of the twins, thus contradicting claims made by Mary Mugford, the mother of Jeremy's girlfriend Julie. Mary testified in court that around Easter 1985, Jeremy had disclosed that his mother was intending to include the twins of Nicholas and Daniel in her will, with the implication being that this may have been why Jeremy murdered the boys, to ensure they did not get a share of his inheritance. Mary Mugford would also provide details regarding Jeremy's relationship with his family, particularly his mother, whom Mary alleged he resented for sending him away to boarding school at just 8 years old. She would also claim that he believed that June's religious stance had a detrimental impact on Sheila's mental state. These details helped to build the prosecution's case that Jeremy had been driven by greed and disdain when he chose to kill his family, and there may have been signs that he'd been planning it for some time prior to committing the deed. One such instance was the suggestion that Neville had included a clause in his will that Jeremy would only be a benefactor if the farm's trustees found that the 24-year-old seemed genuinely interested in playing an active role in running the farm. Whether Jeremy knew of this clause is uncertain, with him stating on the stand that the mention of it in court was the first time he had heard of the matter. However, if he had been aware of it prior, it may account for what some describe as his sudden change of heart, with him going from an individual who sought out the bright lights of the city and wished to travel, to a man who worked 40 or more hours a week on the farm. One person who noted this change was farm labourer Lem Fawkes, who recalled that roughly 3 or 4 years prior to the killings, Jeremy disclosed his plans for the future, which did not involve taking over the farm. Instead, he intended to sell everything and move away. Len did admit, while under cross-examination by defence counsel Geoffrey Rivlin, that in the previous couple of years Jeremy's attitude appeared to have changed, and he had started to seem more committed to taking over his parents' legacy. Len's wife, Dorothy, would present an additional aspect to this commitment, with her alleging that during a conversation in autumn of 1984, Jeremy had claimed he and Sheila didn't get on, and he refused to share his inheritance with her. This detail would be expanded upon by other witnesses, who disclosed that Jeremy felt his sister was unworthy of benefiting from his parents' deaths, as she had done nothing to earn it, whereas he was expected to be involved in the farm in order to inherit his share. While the prosecution did not need to provide a motive for the killings, the idea that Jeremy had feared that the twins would be getting a share of what he felt he was owed, along with his sister, whom he felt was undeserving, may account for why he decided to murder them alongside his parents. Having established a possible why, the prosecution would also provide witnesses who would speak of Jeremy's character and his relationship with his family. One such witness was Jean Battelle, the farm's housekeeper for 20 years. As such, she had known Jeremy since he was roughly 4 years old. She told the court that in all that time she had known him, she could not recall Jeremy being unkind, aggressive, or violent towards his family. However, when Jeremy's relatives took to the stand, they would present him in a different light. One of the key witnesses for the prosecution was Jeremy's cousin, Anne Eaton, who admitted during cross-examination that she and Jeremy had not been particularly close, and she was somewhat surprised by a change in his behaviour towards her in the year prior to the murders. She noted that it started around the time of her birthday in 1984, when he sent her a card, which he had not done previously, and from that point onwards he was pleasant towards her. Anne stated that she viewed this with cynicism and couldn't help feeling he had ulterior motives, particularly when he started supporting her ideas about changes to the caravan park, when in the past he had objected or didn't take her side. She would go on to recollect Jeremy approaching her in July 1985 with regards to purchasing a gun, with him claiming he wanted to acquire a 5-shot automatic 12-bore shotgun. His explanation for this, when asked why he wanted such a weapon, was that he wished to take up shooting and saw himself becoming a country squire. But he did not bring up the matter again, and it was only in the aftermath of the murders that it seemed to have a more significant meaning, as did other comments and incidents which had occurred over the previous years. Anne would tell the court of the ease at which her cousin was able to deceive people, recalling an occasion when they were at a trade fair, and Jeremy convinced a man he was the director of Orsia Road Caravan Park. When she questioned him about how compelling he was, Jeremy replied, "If you're convincing enough, you can make people believe anything." It was a comment which, in the aftermath of the killings, Anne would recall, and gave her cause to question whether her cousin had been able to deceive the police in such a manner also. Anne recounted another instance when she and Jeremy had been discussing changes to the caravan park, and she was confounded when the 24-year-old reassured her not to worry, as within a couple of years the park would be theirs. When asked to explain, Jeremy simply said, "Wait and see." It was another comment which at the time did not linger in her thoughts, but with hindsight and the knowledge that Jeremy would stand to inherit 50% stake in the caravan site, it potentially spoke of a darker meaning, and suggested that Jeremy may have been considering his family's demise for at least a couple of years. Another individual who recalled Jeremy making a seemingly flippant comment was Anne's father, Robert Boutflower. He told the court of a discussion he had undertaken with Jeremy regarding improving security at the caravan park, something they were eager to do due to a number of break-ins and arson attacks. The conversation focused on whether they should hire external help to provide security, or if families should take on the task. But Robert expressed concerns that the latter may end up in a situation where they could be forced to use a weapon to defend themselves, and they would not be able to live with the guilt should their actions result in a death. Jeremy's response stunned his uncle, with him allegedly stating that he could kill anyone, even his own parents. While Robert chastised his nephew for such a stupid remark, it was only in the light of the murders that he considered that it may not have just been a thoughtless comment. Robert's recollection of this interaction would be challenged by the defence counsel, Geoffrey Rivlin, under cross-examination, with it being suggested that such conversation never took place. After all, Robert was the only witness at the time. This was an allegation Robert vehemently denounced, stating, "I was there, and I heard it." Details of Jeremy's behaviour prior to the deaths was accompanied by testimony regarding his demeanour in the aftermath, with various witnesses taking to the stand to disclose their interactions with the 24-year-old. This included PC West, who had received a phone call from Jeremy reporting the issue at the farm. PC West described the 24-year-old's demeanour to the court, stating he had, quote, "no sense of urgency." But under cross-examination, Geoffrey Rivlin referred to the officer's statement written 2 days after the deaths, in which he had noted that the caller had exclaimed, "You've got to help me." He had also noted that Jeremy had been unable to recall his sister's surname. Mr. Rivlin proposed that the caller's repeated pleas for help and forgetfulness suggested that the individual was in a panic state. Yet other officers would concur with the assessment PC West provided the court. One of the first officers to arrive at White House Farm in the early hours of the 7th of August 1985 was PC Stephen Mayo. He was primarily tasked with staying with Jeremy while plans were put in place to enter the home. PC Mayo recalled the 24-year-old being remarkably calm, and as the siege spanned over 3 hours, the pair spoke about a number of topics, including Jeremy's desire to buy a Porsche with the money he was due to earn from a profitable year at the caravan park. This was a detail which would be picked up by the press, and presented as an example of Jeremy's frivolous mindset despite the severity of the situation he was currently in. However, when it came time to deliver his evidence on stand, Jeremy would explain that he was talking about buying a kit car, which was worth significantly less than an actual Porsche. Continuing his evidence on the stand, PC Mayo clarified that the purchase of the car was a brief comment amidst many subjects they discussed, with the officer explaining that he had attempted to keep Jeremy engaged in conversation as a means of distracting him from what may be occurring inside the home. The police constable did disclose that, in retrospect, he and other officers did find Jeremy's calmness to be disconcerting, given the severity of the situation. But any suggestion that the 24-year-old was completely unmoved by events was dispelled by the testimony of Dr. Ian Craig. He had been called to the scene to provide death pronouncements on the family members, but he also spent some time with Jeremy, explaining under the defence's cross-examination that the young man appeared in shock after receiving the news that his family were deceased. The doctor recalled Jeremy asking why his father couldn't come to see him, and when advised Neville was dead, the defendant cried and seemed visibly shaken. This prompted the doctor to give Jeremy some whiskey to help calm him, and shortly afterwards Dr. Craig observed the 24-year-old vomiting in a nearby field. Statements which suggested Jeremy wasn't coping well with the news of his family's deaths also came from DC Mick Clarke, who testified that upon being told, Jeremy had replied, "Sheila ought to be in a nut house for what she's done," implying that he hadn't understood that his sister was also deceased. It would be another officer who would attempt to make Jeremy realise the gravity of the situation, with DS Stan Jones advising the 24-year-old that all 5 members of his family were deceased within inside the home, and it was a reality he needed to accept, prompting Jeremy to respond, "You're a hard bastard, aren't you?" While the police remained at the scene, Jeremy was taken to his cottage in Goldhanger, where friends and family members began to arrive. Also in attendance were DS Mick Clarke and DS Stan Jones, who had been tasked with collecting statements from key witnesses. DC Clarke recalled that Jeremy seemed calm but preoccupied, as the 24-year-old made efforts to organise for someone to continue bringing in the harvest. The question for the jury was whether this was the actions of a man in shock, trying to continue as normal to avoid the reality of the situation, or was it representative of a cold, calculating individual who had killed his family just hours before. As the 2 officers remained at the home, they were privy to Jeremy's interactions and manner throughout the day. He went through stages of distress and sadness to a seemingly jovial countenance. DS Jones recounted to the court that when Jeremy and his girlfriend went into the dining room alone, he believed he heard Jeremy either cough or chuckle, with the officer adding that it was from that moment his suspicions of the 24-year-old began. The jury was also instructed that Jeremy had been advised that certain items in the home had been damaged, such as carpets and furniture, and like with everything else in this case, 2 versions of the story have emerged. There is one which claims Jeremy was provided a form and asked to sign it authorising the destruction of the items, and the other being that it was Jeremy who had requested the items be destroyed and was then given the form. Either way, the items were discarded, with a photographer able to capture an image of them on a bonfire outside the house. The removal of items by the police would be criticised, and would divide opinion. Had Jeremy requested the destruction of the items in hope of eradicating evidence? Or had the police been too quick to conclude they were dealing with a murder-suicide and wanted to close the case as soon as possible? While this decision would prove a bone of contention for both Jeremy and the police, other aspects of his behaviour in the days following the deaths were disclosed to the court by the prosecution, adding to their efforts to present Jeremy in a negative light. It was noted that within hours of the deaths becoming public knowledge, the press had tried to make contact with Jeremy, with some ringing the house phone while others were audacious enough to turn up at the cottage. DC Clarke wanted to shield Jeremy from this harassment, but he told the court he was surprised to find that Jeremy had purchased every newspaper and had them spread out in the cottage when the officer returned to the house the following day. Jeremy's interest in the press coverage didn't end there, with a friend recalling that the 24-year-old had set the video recorder to capture the news coverage of Sheila, June and Neville's funerals while they went out to dinner, and he was annoyed when the recording failed. Others would note Jeremy's behaviour in the weeks after the deaths, with many stating that his demeanour and actions were not what they were expecting from a grieving man. Some recalled he had a jovial mood, while others recounted the various meals and trips away the 24-year-old had undertaken, as though he didn't have a care in the world. He seemed preoccupied with money, with one of his first tasks in the days after the deaths being his meeting with his bank manager to discuss the family finances, and an appointment with the family solicitor, Basil Clarke, to discuss the wills. Just 2 days after the deaths, Jeremy had also asked the police whether they could confirm the order in which each member had died, as this may affect the beneficiaries. Alongside this, he had arranged for Sotheby's to value the house contents, which he then proceeded to sell. The farm secretary, Barbara Wilson, took to the stand to recount a conversation with Jeremy regarding increasing the insurance on the home, which he had been advised to do by Basil Clarke. However, Jeremy opted to increase it further when he learned that items were not adequately covered, given the value of the contents which had been appraised by Sotheby's. Barbara also recalled an unsettling interaction with Jeremy in the office, which was filled with many sentimental items that Neville had kept over the years. She explained her dismay when Jeremy walked into the room, sat in the chair and put his feet upon the desk, as he stated in a dismissive manner that everything needed to be removed. He claimed that he did not want any reminder of his father, but Barbara told the jury that she didn't perceive this as grief, because his demeanour was arrogant and nasty. During the defence's cross-examination, Barbara was asked by Geoffrey Rivlin whether she had misinterpreted the situation, but she insisted there was no way she could have mistaken his attitude. Barbara also recalled her last conversation with Neville, during which she described him as being uncharacteristically abrupt, telling the court that she felt she had interrupted an argument. While neither the prosecution nor the defence could say with certainty what occurred on the night of the 7th of August 1985, with Barbara Wilson being one of the last people to speak to a family member, the competing counsels would put forward their own scenarios, with both conceding that there were only 2 possible culprits. They reached this conclusion because, in Jeremy's own words, Sheila had hold of the gun. If this was the truth, then his sister had killed the family, with the deceased being found inside a locked home, with the gun resting on her chest. Or Jeremy had lied about receiving a call from his father, and had staged the scene in order to implicate Sheila. So had Jeremy really received a phone call from Neville that morning, stating that Sheila had gone mad and had hold of a gun? While there were no phone records to answer whether or not the call occurred, one detail of Jeremy's testimony did seem to ring true, as the phone was found with the receiver off the hook. This implied that, as Jeremy had stated, the call to him had been ended by someone putting their finger on the receiver instead of hanging up the phone, and while the prosecution argued Jeremy had potentially done this while staging the scene, the defence countered that the receiver's location was proof the call happened. The prosecution would continue to build on the notion that Jeremy had meticulously plotted the murders and had attempted to cover up his crime by using Sheila's illness as a misdirection. It started with his phone call to the police, which was taken by PC West at Chelmsford Control Room. During this interaction, Jeremy planted the first seeds by advising that his sister had gone mad and had hold of a gun. This exchange would also feature one of many errors made by the police during the investigation, with PC West admitting that he had logged the time at 3:36 a.m, using the digital clock in the room. However, he realised this was incorrect, and the caller was actually received at 3:26 a.m, with the logs being amended accordingly. This new time was corroborated by the testimony of Malcolm Bonnet, who confirmed that he had dispatched cars to the scene by 3:35 a.m. However, Anthony Arledge would raise several questions which inferred that the call from Neville to his son had not occurred. He questioned why it took Jeremy 10 minutes to call the police following the alleged call from Neville, and why had the 24-year-old looked up the station's telephone number rather than calling 999. The prosecution questioned if it was an urgent situation, why had Jeremy not called upon relatives or the farm workers who lived in the cottage nearby to go and see what was happening. Instead, he had supposedly spent 10 minutes looking through the phone book, called the police, then called his girlfriend Julie, who was at least 50 miles away and thus in no position to help. He also highlighted that upon agreeing to meet the police at the farmhouse, Jeremy's vehicle was observed driving slowly along the country lane by the responding officers. Mr. Arledge would suggest that all these actions implied that Jeremy was not treating the situation with any urgency. Was that because he knew that his family were already deceased? The prosecution turned to the veracity of the call from Neville by advising the jury that it was believed the 61-year-old had initially been attacked in the main bedroom and had come downstairs either to confront his attacker or use the phone. Yet there was an issue with the second scenario, with the prosecution referring to the extensive injuries Neville had sustained to his jaw, which would have rendered him unable to speak. Furthermore, the phone would have had blood on it, yet when officers entered the home, the handset was off the hook but clean. While the location of the handset supported Jeremy's claims that the call had ended abruptly, as though someone had placed their finger on the receiver, there were issues with the fact that Jeremy was seemingly able to make another call. When police contacted British Telecom shortly after arriving at the scene, an engineer was able to test the phone line and confirm that it was still open, meaning the phone was off the hook, with the engineer reporting that they could hear a dog barking. However, it would be argued that if the line was open, Jeremy would not have been able to make another call from his cottage in Goldhanger. Another aspect of the calls which would be brought into contention would be the timings of when they were made or received, with Jeremy claiming that he had received the call from his father at around 10 past to 3:15. He contacted the police at 3:26 a.m. and then he called Julie at around 3:30. However, none of these timings, except the call to the police, could be verified, with Julie providing contradictory testimony which stated that Jeremy had called her at 3:10, which implied that the call from Neville never occurred, in which case, how did he know there was an issue at the farm? Upon his arrival at the farmhouse that August morning, Jeremy would furnish the attending officers with details regarding the layout of the property, the locations of the guns, and his sister's mental state, including the detail that she'd been recently released from a psychiatric hospital. One officer who interacted with Jeremy at the scene was Inspector Douglas Adams, who recalled to the court that he had discussed with the 24-year-old ways in which they could build rapport with Sheila should they make contact with her. Inspector Adams reported, quote, Mr. Bamber said she might want to speak to a Dr. Ferguson from Harley Street, who had treated her, and that she liked to be told she was pretty. While many of the officers who testified spoke of Jeremy's calmness, Inspector Adams, during cross-examination by Geoffrey Rivlin, conceded that the 24-year-old had shown some concern, with the young man asking the officer, quote, what if anything has happened in there? They're all the family I've got. Almost 4 hours after the first officers had arrived at the farmhouse, entry was made to the home, yet this delay caused some issues, as recalled by Dr. Ian Craig, who would state that it wasn't possible to estimate when the family had died, and all he could say was that deaths occurred in quick succession at some point during the night. Dr. Craig would also recall Jeremy telling him about the discussion at the kitchen table that occurred the previous night, with him stating that Neville and June were concerned that Sheila was unable to care for the children and had been physically violent towards the boys. This detail could be viewed as another element of Jeremy building the narrative, leading the police to conclude that the discussion may have triggered a schizophrenic episode, and the suggestion that the 28-year-old had been violent towards her children implied she was capable of hurting them. However, when Dr. Craig asked whether Sheila's ill treatment of the twins had been reported to the authorities, Jeremy claimed it hadn't been in order to protect the family's reputation. This also meant that there was no means by which to confirm or denounce his accusations. During the trial, the jury were shown photos of the scene that awaited the officers when they entered the farm that warm August morning. Alongside these images, the court was provided details of each family member's final moments. Neville was discovered in the kitchen, amidst a scene of chaos which suggested a violent struggle had occurred. The 61-year-old was slumped awkwardly over a chair, his head almost resting upon a coal scuttle beside the auger, and his pyjama trousers were around his ankles. Pathologist Dr. Peter Vanessas would detail the full extent of the injuries Neville had sustained, including a fractured skull, 2 black eyes, severe bruising to his head and body, along with numerous cuts. Speaking of the remarkable fight the 61-year-old had put up against his attacker, Dr. Vanessas divulged that he believed that despite being shot multiple times, Neville continued to fight. He had been beaten with the butt of the rifle, and his ordeal was only ended after another 4 bullets had been fired into his body. It was also noted that Neville's back bore markings which, although not conclusive, were believed to have been caused by the barrel of the gun being pressed against his back, suggesting his attacker had attempted to control him. Neville had suffered a total of 8 gunshot wounds. Some were believed to have occurred in the bedroom, with the suggestion being that he had fled downstairs to either confront the attacker, perhaps as they headed to reload the gun, or the 61-year-old had gone to make the phone call to Jeremy, and the call had been ended, maybe when the assailant pressed the gun against Neville's back. The prosecution would argue that Jeremy was responsible. He was proficient with guns, had the strength to overpower his father, and had a motive driven by greed and hatred. It was evident that the 61-year-old Neville Bamber had died a violent death at the hands of his attacker, and the scene in the main bedroom also spoke of the horrors of that night. A scenario was presented which suggested that Neville and June were first attacked in the bedroom, with the pair initially being shot while they were in bed. It appeared as though Neville, who was believed to have been shot 4 times in the room due to shell casings found there, was able to make his way downstairs, where the struggle with his assailant took place. Meanwhile, in the bedroom, a trail of blood which led from June's body to the opposite side of the bed suggested that she had made her way to that point, either to reach a door which gave access to the twins' bedroom, or to reach the phone which should have been on the nightstand, only to find it was missing. It would emerge that a recent electrical storm had damaged the phone lines, and some of the phones had recently been replaced. However, the one in the bedroom had been a rotary phone, which had inexplicably been moved to the kitchen. It was this phone that Neville allegedly called Jeremy from. As for the phone that should have been in the kitchen, this handset was discovered in working order under a pile of magazines several days after the deaths. The moving of the phones could possibly be explained by the fault which occurred after the storm. Perhaps the bedroom foreman had been moved to the kitchen while the repairs were undertaken, and it hadn't been returned to its usual spot. Or had the killer moved the phones to make it harder for anyone to call for help? The phone missing from the bedside would have prevented June from requesting assistance, and having used her energy to stumble round the bed, only to find it wasn't there, she had made her way back towards the door, perhaps hoping to make her escape. However, before she could exit the room, the assailant returned, with Dr. Vanessa stating that the streaks of blood that had flowed down her body suggested that the 61-year-old was standing when the attacker entered the room for the second time. The doctor would also note that June had endured 2 gunshot wounds to her chest, one to her right arm, another to her neck, and one to her knee. Yet despite this, June fought for her life, as evidenced by the defensive wounds on her arms and legs. The gun would be discharged 2 more times, issuing 1 bullet into the side of June's head, while the second was delivered at point-blank range between the eyes. This final bullet proved fatal, and the 61-year-old fell to the floor, with her body resting against the bedroom door. The order of the deaths could not be verified, but it is known that the attacker had also entered the bedroom where the 6-year-old twins were sleeping. Daniel was shot 4 times in the back of the head, with all the bullets being issued in quick succession, while a 5th bullet was fired just above his ear shortly afterwards, suggesting the possibility the killer returned to issue more shots. Daniel's twin brother Nicholas received 3 gunshot wounds to the back of his head. The position the boys were found in suggested they were likely still asleep when the fatal shots were fired. As stated, the evidence would imply that not all the shots were inflicted at the same time. This theory came about not only because of the potential delay of Daniel's last shot, but because Nicholas had a contact wound, but none of his blood had been found inside the silencer. This was a detail which ballistic expert Malcolm Fletcher would explain could have occurred because there was a pause between the shots, with the prior injury slowing the flow of blood in the child's body, meaning that less would be expelled from the wound. Sheila's fate was one which would be scrutinised the most, as it had been initially believed she was the perpetrator, until suspicion had fallen upon Jeremy. The key point which was highlighted in the court included the fact that Sheila had received 2 gunshot wounds to the neck. It was claimed that despite the severity of the initial wound, she may have still been able to function, while the second shot had killed her instantly. When her body was found, Sheila was lying on her back on the floor, parallel with the bed in her parents' bedroom, just yards away from the connecting door to her twins' bedroom. Beside her lay a blood-stained Bible, and resting upon her chest was the .22 Anschutz rifle, which Jeremy claimed he had forgotten to put away the previous night, with him noting that when he left it, there was no scope or silencer on the weapon. When the gun was fingerprinted by D.I. Ron Cook, he acquired 2 prints, one from the butt of the rifle which matched with Jeremy's forefinger, while another was determined to be Sheila's right-hand ring finger, which provided further evidence that there were only 2 possible suspects. D.I. Cook would also reveal that during the processing of the scene, he had lifted Sheila's hand in order to view, quote, the blood marks which were not readily visible under the wrist. This helped explain the discrepancies seen in the crime scene photos taken by D.I. Bird, which showed her hand was in a different position. This same explanation was given for the rifle being photographed on Sheila's body in the room, yet when a shot from the stairs looking towards the main bedroom was taken, the gun was leaning against the windowsill. D.I. Cook explained that this second image was captured once the main bedroom had been processed, and the gun had been moved in order to secure it ready for collection. It wasn't just the crime scene which initially led police to conclude they were dealing with a murder-suicide, but the words of the surviving family member. Jeremy had informed the police, as they waited to gain entry to the home, of the discussion that occurred at the table the night before, during which it was implied Sheila was incapable of caring for her children and that fostering should be considered. Jeremy disclosed the details of Neville's phone call, stating she had gone mad and had a gun, a weapon he claimed she was capable of using, while also providing details that Sheila was schizophrenic. These details, combined with the fact that upon arrival at the home, the police found that all the doors and windows were secure, caused them to quickly conclude that they were dealing with a murder-suicide. However, during his testimony, Dr. Vanessas would state that he was unable to reach the same conclusion, as he could not discern whether Sheila had ended her life or whether she had died at someone else's hand. During cross-examination by the defence counsel Geoffrey Rivlin, Dr. Vanessas advised, quote, one should never be surprised at the sight of suicide injuries, implying that no matter how improbable it may seem, Sheila may have actually shot herself twice. This was a conclusion the defence hoped the jury would also consider, yet the prosecution had evidence on their side which suggested otherwise, including a silencer which had been recovered from a gun cupboard in a downstairs room, a location which seemed improbable given that Sheila died upstairs holding the gun. Sheila's lack of ability or interest in guns was stated by her cousin David Boutflower, who also told the jury that 3 days after the killings, a silencer was found wrapped up in the gun cupboard and was taken back to his sister Anne's home, where he examined it at the kitchen table. He detailed that he noted that the bluing, which was the protective coating on the silencer, had come away, and he stated that this could only occur if the metal had been struck with considerable force. Alongside this damage, he noted red paint caught on the nailed end. This, the jury were informed, matched the paint that surrounded the Aga in the kitchen, which also showed signs of being damaged recently. David Boutflower's testimony continued, with him explaining that he took the silencer apart in order to view the baffles inside, and that was when he noticed a red substance. Anne Eaton would support her brother's testimony with regards to the discovery and examination of the silencer, with her going on to state that when she saw the congealed substance, she believed it was blood, but wasn't certain whether it was human or animal. The silencer was collected from Anne's home by D.S. Stan Jones, who recorded that he had spotted a grey hair caught in the damaged metal. However, by the time the silencer arrived at the laboratory, the hair was missing, and the forensics team were not informed of its existence. It was implied that this hair may have been Neville's and had become attached to the weapon during the assault. However, forensic expert John Haywood would denounce this idea by stating he wouldn't have placed much significance on the hair, even if it was proven to be Neville's. He explained that because the item was recovered from the victim's home, the chances that his hair may be on it were high, and there was no way to determine how or when it had become attached. With regards to the evidence he was able to process, John Haywood confirmed that the congealed substance found on the silencer was human blood, which was of the same grouping as Sheila's. Mr. Haywood also dismissed the suggestion that it could have been a mixture of June and Neville's blood, by stating it was just a remote possibility. The ballistic expert Malcolm Fletcher's testimony added to the assertion that the blood in the silencer was Sheila's, with him stating, quote, "My opinion on this is that the blood in the sound moderator was due to the contact shot to the neck of Sheila Caffell," explaining that this was caused by a phenomenon known as backspatter, which is when blood droplets from a wound move in the opposite direction to the original force. In this case, the gun being fired caused the blood to disperse into the silencer due to its proximity to the wound. However, during the defence's cross-examination, Mr. Fletcher admitted that not all ballistic experts agree on the concept of backspatter. John Haywood's testimony continued, with him providing evidence regarding various items of bloodstained clothing which were produced for the court. As Sheila's turquoise nightdress was exhibited, Mr. Haywood pointed out that the blood pattern on the garment implied she had not been lying down when she was shot. This was details corroborated by the testimony of Dr. Vanessas, who stated that Sheila's wounds were consistent with her being in a seated position, and that the second shot would have caused her body to fall backwards. Mr. Haywood's testimony then turned to the items of Jeremy's, which he admitted were only tested several weeks after the murders. He informed the jury that blood was found on the sleeve of a jacket, a bathrobe, and on the passenger seat of Jeremy's vehicle. Despite testing these samples, he was only able to identify the blood as human, but could not confirm who it came from or when the stains had occurred. The silencer proved to be a pivotal part in the case, not only because it contained Sheila's blood, which implied she had been shot while it was on the rifle, but David Boutflower would testify that he had observed flecks of red paint alongside the damage to the metal surface. It was disclosed that the paint and a large scratch on the outside of the silencer were consistent with it coming into contact with the mantel above the Aga in the kitchen, with both the silencer and the mantel having the same 15 layers of paint. Damage to the mantel, which Anne, David and D.S. Jones all attested to seeing, was consistent with being struck with a silencer, which in turn explained the scratch found on the item. These details, according to the prosecution, prove that the silencer had been attached to the gun during the struggle between Neville and his assailant. However, the defence would counter this by suggesting there was no way of proving when the damage had occurred, and it was possible it had happened prior to the attacks. Yet the testimony from Neville's nephew, Anthony Pargeter, would narrow down this time frame, as he told the court that he had seen the Anshots just a couple of weeks before the killings, recalling it was in excellent condition, with a silencer and sight attached. Prosecutor Anthony Orledge made sure to inform the jury that Jeremy had told the police that he had left the gun out the night prior to the killings and had stated there was no sight or silencer on it. This detail prompted the question that if the silencer wasn't on the gun when Jeremy left the farmhouse at 9:30, then who had put it on the weapon? Once again, there were only two possible options. It was either Jeremy or Sheila. Both the prosecution and the defence understood that the gun and its silencer were the prime exhibits. They would utilise the evidence to present their own arguments, with the prosecution introducing details which would implicate Jeremy. They would call upon Robert Radcliffe to testify as the individual who had sold the Anschuts to Neville Bamber on the 30th of November 1984, alongside 500 rounds of ammo, a purchase which Jeremy was present for. During his time on the stand, Mr. Radcliffe would provide details regarding the weapon, explaining that attaching the silencer and sight was not an easy task, implying that whoever attached it had some expertise in handling the weapon. The prosecution would argue that Sheila, according to relatives and friends, was a novice with guns, whereas Jeremy was proficient in their use, and was said to be a very good shot. For the prosecution, this aligned with the ballistic evidence, which stated that all 24 shots were fired with a degree of accuracy, which pointed to the shooter being someone familiar with guns. Aside from Sheila's lack of expertise, the prosecution also pointed out the details that made it unlikely that she had been the shooter. They addressed the fact that the magazine on the gun could only hold 10 bullets at a time, with ballistic expert Malcolm Fletcher advising that as 25 shots were fired, the magazine was likely reloaded twice. He stated that to do this took some effort because as each bullet was loaded, it became harder to insert the next, although he countered this by stating that a teenager or adult would likely accomplish the task. He did, however, encounter one issue while carrying out tests on the gun, with Mr. Fletcher explaining that the magazine release mechanism was faulty and he had broken a thumbnail because of this defect. This last detail supported the prosecution's assertion that loading the magazine would likely have caused damage to Sheila's nails, yet the manicure she had only showed the wear and tear expected to find with polish that had been applied several days earlier. Aside from her virtually intact manicure, was the detail that Sheila's hands contained minimum traces of lead, nor were there any signs of the waxy residue which coated the bullets, further supporting the notion that she had not used the gun. Malcolm Fletcher also recalled that Sheila's clothing was devoid of any evidence which would indicate she had wielded the weapon. The primary focus of the prosecution's case fell upon the silencer, which they argued had been on the gun when Neville was attacked in the kitchen. So how was the gun found on Sheila's body without the silencer attached? And how had the silencer come to be in a downstairs gun cupboard? John Haywood, the forensic expert from the police laboratory, would testify that he had found traces of blood in the silencer, which matched with Sheila's blood group, implying that she had been shot while the moderator was attached to the weapon. The prosecution argued that it was highly unlikely that after shooting herself once with the silencer on the gun, Sheila would then go downstairs, wrap up the moderator and place it neatly in a box within the gun cupboard. Once again, Haywood's testimony would reflect that of Dr. Vanessis's, who stated that the staining on Sheila's nightgown was not consistent with the theory that she had walked around after she had been shot, adding that the first gunshot to the neck would have likely immobilised her, and she would have been bleeding profusely. The prosecution used the severity of her injury and the fact there was seemingly no traces of blood in or around the gun cupboard as evidence to support the claim that Sheila was not the perpetrator. Another aspect which spoke of the improbability of her being the shooter was the suggestion that if the silence had been on the weapon, she would not have been able to reach the trigger with the gun placed beneath her chin. It was a scenario tested by Malcolm Fletcher at the Forensic Science Lab with the assistance of 3 women who were roughly Sheila's height and build. The participants were asked to see if they were able to reach the trigger while the gun, complete with silencer, was placed beneath their chin. Mr. Fletcher explained that although it was awkward to do so, all three women were able to position the gun in the correct position, and despite their nails being a hindrance, they could reach the trigger, however they struggled to pull it. In all, he concluded that this experiment demonstrated there was only a remote chance Sheila had been able to fire the weapon with the silencer attached. This, combined with the unlikely scenario that Sheila would have shot herself, gone downstairs to the gun cupboard and then returned to the bedroom to issue the second shot, led to Anthony Arledge suggesting that Sheila's killer had gone to lay the gun complete with silencer on her body and realised that she wouldn't reach the trigger, prompting her assailant to remove the silencer, concealing it in the back of the cupboard, hoping it would not be connected to the crime. In order to make the scene appear more convincing, the assailant had then ensured the gun was positioned on Sheila's chest, and had placed an open Bible nearby as a ploy used to portray the scene as a murder-suicide. Various witnesses would also claim that the notion that Sheila had killed her family and then turned the gun on herself was unthinkable. Labourer Lem Fawkes, who had worked at White House Farm for 36 years, and his daughter Julie, had observed Sheila playing with the twins on the afternoon prior to their deaths, with the trio seeming happy and relaxed. While others reported that even though her medication made her appear as though she was in a world of her own, there had not been any concerning behaviour or suicidal ideations. Others pointed to the fact that her medication had caused stiffness or weakness in her limbs, causing them to question whether she could have been strong enough to not only wield the weapon, but overpower her 6'4", well-built father. The prosecution also pointed out that the scene in the kitchen suggested a violent struggle had occurred, and while Neville was riddled with injuries, Sheila had none, except for the 2 gunshot wounds. The attack on Neville and the children was also raised as a point of contention, with witnesses contradicting Jeremy's allegation that Sheila had been an unfit mother, instead presenting testimony that she was actually a doting parent who strove to put the twins' needs before her own and had never been violent towards them. Her ex-husband, Colin Cathell, spoke of Sheila's love for their children and vehemently denied that she would ever hurt them. He did concede that his former wife had a hot Latin temper, yet any violent outbursts tended to be directed at inanimate objects rather than at people. Some witnesses would express the sentiment that they could perceive Sheila attacking June, whose religious leanings, they argued, had impacted the 28-year-old's mental state, but they could not imagine her assaulting Neville, a man who she had turned to during moments of distress and had been a calming presence in her life. However, Pamela Boutflower would testify that on the night of the killings, she had briefly spoken to Sheila, who didn't interact much, and when June took over the phone call, she had expressed concerns regarding her daughter's behaviour. Anne Eaton would confirm that she too had noticed Sheila's unusual nature, but advised that the true extent of her cousin's illness was not fully disclosed to the extended family. While the testimonies of Pamela and Anne suggested that Sheila's situation may have been more serious than they were led to believe, the prosecution would argue that it was not so severe that she would have turned the gun on herself and her family. In arguing the case for Sheila's innocence, the prosecution had to explain how the killings had occurred within a seemingly locked house. It had been noted that all the doors and windows in the property, except the window in the main bedroom, which June tended to leave open on a night, had been secured, and, with nothing to suggest that entry had been made through the main bedroom window, police were confronted with a question regarding how the killer had gotten into the home. To explain this, Anthony Arledge would suggest that Jeremy had gained access via a window in the downstairs toilet, as supported by the evidence provided by DS Neil Davidson, who told the court he had discovered a hacksaw blade on the ground close to the window on the 3rd of October 1985, almost 2 months after the deaths. When compared to the damage to the paint on the inside of the window, it was deduced that this blade had been used to manipulate the catch in order to open the window from the outside. Additionally, it was found that the frame had been painted just a few weeks prior to the deaths, so the damage was recent. During police interviews and at trial, Jeremy would go on to admit he had used this window on numerous occasions, including one occasion after the murders. He stated that it was on roughly the 16th of September. He had entered the farm via the window in order to get some documents he required for travelling. As this had occurred after the murders and prior to J.S. Davison's discovery of the hacksaw blade, it cast doubt on when the damage had occurred. However, the prosecution would suggest that Jeremy's knowledge of the window offered a means of entering the home undetected, and he would utilise his familiarity with the quirks of the old house in order to exit the property while presenting the appearance it was secure. Anthony Arledge brought to the jury's attention the flaw in the locking mechanism of the kitchen window, which could be manipulated into place from the outside of the building, a fault Annie had discovered and had been tested by DS Stan Jones. The prosecution suggested that Jeremy would have known about this issue and had used it to leave the crime scene, but he had not taken into account that the housekeeper, Jean Battelle, would notice that the items on the sill were out of place. As for transport to and from the crime scene, the prosecution would propose that Jeremy had left his car parked outside his cottage to give the illusion he was home, and he had used his mother's bike to traverse the 15-minute route to White House Farm, utilising back roads and farm tracks to avoid detection. Mr. Arledge pointed to the fact that the bike was recovered from Jeremy's home, and that the wheels were caked in mud as evidence that this had been his mode of transport that night. While the prosecution built up their case against Jeremy, the evidence presented did not directly link him to the crime. However, it would garner more impact when 21-year-old Julie Mugford took to the stand. Join me next time as the trial of Jeremy Bamber continues.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.